Let me know where you are watching from in the comments below, and hit that like button if you believe that silence is never a sign of weakness. It is simply the sound of a predator patiently setting a trap. My name is Maya, I am 30 years old, and if there is one profound truth I have learned about generational wealth, it is that money does not buy class, and it certainly does not buy loyalty. My billionaire father believed he held all the cards when he violently crashed my wedding reception. He wanted to publicly disown me for daring to marry a public high school history teacher instead of a wealthy corporate heir, and slammed a heavy, intimidating legal contract onto my sweetheart table, stripping away my $5 million trust fund in front of 300 of the city's most elite, judgmental guests. He laughed a cruel, victorious laugh when my husband calmly signed the spousal waiver without putting up a single fight. But my father made one catastrophic, irreversible miscalculation. He did not realize that the daughter he had just humiliated was not a struggling, insignificant accountant. I am the founder and chief executive officer of a ruthless classified private equity and forensic auditing firm that contracts with the federal government. And he did not know that by cutting me off and severing my legal ties to the family trust, he had just handed my firm the legal clearance to dismantle his billion-dollar corporate empire piece by piece. Before I continue this story, subscribe to the channel if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family who severely underestimated your worth. The soft, elegant notes of the jazz quartet floating through the Ritz-Carlton ballroom were suddenly annihilated by a violent, ear-piercing screech of microphone feedback. I flinched hard in my seat, my hands instinctively gripping the edge of the sweetheart table. The romantic, planned ambiance of my wedding reception shattered in a single instant. My father, Sterling, a man who had built a massive logistics empire from the ground up, and never let anyone in our elite social circle forget it, stormed onto the raised dais. He did not look like the proud, tearful father of the bride celebrating a joyous union. With his tailored tuxedo jacket unbuttoned and his jaw locked in a furious, aggressive grind, he looked like a ruthless corporate raider preparing for a hostile takeover. Without a single word of warning, he ripped the microphone from the hands of the best man, right in the middle of a heartfelt toast. The entire ballroom of 300 guests, a glittering sea of the city's most prominent, wealthy socialites, fell into a stunned, breathless silence. You could hear a pin drop over the expensive floral arrangements. Sterling marched over to our table, his expensive Italian leather shoes echoing on the hardwood floor. He did not offer a warm smile or a congratulatory embrace. Instead, he slammed a thick, tabbed stack of legal documents right onto the pristine white tablecloth. The aggressive force of the impact knocked over my crystal champagne flute, sending a river of expensive vintage spilling over the edge, shattering glass on the floor and splashing cold liquid onto the intricate lace hem of my bridal gown. "You really thought I would let this happen?" My father's voice boomed through the microphone, harsh and unforgiving, echoing violently off the crystal chandeliers above us. "You really thought you could bring this absolute embarrassment into our family, and I would just smile for the cameras and foot the bill?" I stared down at the legal documents, the harsh black ink stark against the heavy white paper. It was a formal renunciation of assets. I had spent years navigating corporate fraud, unearthing the dark hidden secrets of powerful people. I analyzed catastrophic financial risks for a living. Yet, I had never felt as profoundly blindsided as I did in this very moment, and failed to predict that my own blood would execute a coordinated, devastating strike at my wedding reception. "Dad, what are you doing?" I whispered, keeping my voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding my veins. "Please, not now. This is my wedding day. You lost the right to call it a wedding when you chose him." Sterling sneered, pointing a heavy diamond-ringed finger at my new husband Julian. He let out a loud mocking snort that echoed through the speakers. "You chose to marry a public high school history teacher. A man earning 50 grand a year, a man who brings no status, no financial leverage, and zero value to this family legacy I broke my back to build." The collective gasp from the wedding guests was audible. Women in expensive silk gowns whispered furiously behind their manicured hands. Men in custom tuxedos shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging wide-eyed, judgmental glances. My mother, Vivian, sat still at the head table. She was sipping her sparkling water, refusing to meet my eyes as my father tore my world apart. Her absolute silence was her total endorsement. My father paced in front of our table, clearly reveling in the captive audience, turning my heartbreak into his own personal theater. I gave you every single opportunity, Maya, and offered you the world on a silver platter, and you spit on it for a life of pathetic mediocrity. You want to be a struggling teacher's wife. Fine, but you will not do it on my dime. Sign the papers. He tapped the documents aggressively, leaving a smudge on the crisp white page. This is a total renunciation of your $5 million trust fund. You are cut off and are disowned, effective immediately. You will not get a single penny of my inheritance. Before I could even process the sheer, unadulterated cruelty of his public execution, the sharp click of designer heels sounded against the polished floor. My younger sister Chloe strutted up to the table. She was wearing a custom couture gown that was arguably more elaborate, brighter, and certainly more revealing than my own bridal dress, and stood next to our father, a smug, triumphant smile plastered across her face, acting as his loyal enforcer. She casually adjusted her heavy diamond tennis bracelet, holding her wrist up just long enough to make sure the ballroom lighting caught the stones perfectly. You should have listened to Mom, Maya, Chloe said, leaning into the microphone my father held. You could have married someone with actual status. Someone who knows how to provide and protect a legacy. Like my husband DeAndre, she gestured grandly toward the front row of VIP tables where her husband, DeAndre, sat flashing his gold Rolex and leaning back with an arrogant, self-satisfied grin. He was the chief financial officer of my father's company, and he looked like the picture of fake wealth, a man, playing a role he had not earned. Chloe leaned over our table, her eyes filled with undisguised venom. But you always had to be the difficult one, didn't you? You declined the legacy admission to Spelman College just to prove a point. You threw away the network, the elite connections, the legacy Mom tried to hand you, all to forge your own pathetic little path. And look where it got you. You are a stubborn, broke embarrassment to this family. She sneered, looking Julian up and down with profound disgust. You always thought you were better than the social clubs, better than the charity galas. Remember when you refused to wear the designer gown Mom bought you for the cotillion ball? You have always wanted to be poor, Maya. Dad is just finally granting your wish. Sign the papers, pay for your own miserable life. My heart pounded violently against my ribs. I looked at Julian, expecting him to be flushed red with humiliation. I expected him to be angry, maybe ready to stand up and fight my father to defend his honor. But Julian did not flinch, he did not yell, his body language was terrifyingly calm, almost unnervingly still. He sat tall in his chair, his tailored suit unwrinkled, exuding a quiet, immense authority, and was a man secure in his own skin, unbothered by the superficial insults of a billionaire bully. He gently reached out and took the pen from my shaking fingers. His touch was warm and steady, instantly grounding me in the midst of my family's chaotic, theatrical cruelty. Julian looked up at my father, a serene, almost pitying smile resting on his face. He pulled the thick stack of legal documents towards himself and did not bother to read the fine print or ask to consult a lawyer or beg for a moment to consider the ramifications. He simply flipped straight to the very last page, locating the spousal waiver of claims, and signed his name with fluid, confident, sweeping strokes, and slid the heavy stack of papers back across the wet table towards Sterling, right over the spilled champagne. We do not need your money, sir, Julian said calmly. His voice was not amplified by a microphone, but it carried clearly and steadily in the silent, tense room. May your wealth keep you warm at night, because your family certainly will not. My father stared at the signature for a brief second before letting out a harsh, barking laugh. He snatched the papers off the tablecloth, clutching them like a grand prize. Stupid, arrogant pride, Sterling scoffed loudly, waving the signed renunciation in the air for the crowd to see. You two deserve each other, have a nice quiet life in the lower middle class. He turned on his heel and stormed out of the ballroom, his head held high. Chloe shot me one last lingering look of absolute disgust before linking arms with DeAndre and following my father out the grand double doors. Within minutes, the brutal exodus began. Over half the guests, the ones whose businesses, investments, and social standings relied on my father's goodwill and money, stood up in unison. They filed out of the reception in droves, murmuring awkward apologies, or simply keeping their heads down and avoiding my gaze completely. The grand festive ballroom felt suddenly cavernous, cold, and devastatingly empty. I sat there frozen, my chest tight, but I did not cry. Julian leaned over, wrapping his strong arm around my waist and pulling me close against his side. He kissed my forehead, offering silent, unwavering support. I looked at the empty ballroom and looked at the spilled champagne and the shattered glass on the floor. I slowly raised my hand, wiping a small drop of wine from my cheek. And then I let out a soft chuckle. The chuckle grew into a genuine, relaxed smile. My family had just played their final hand. They had severed my legal ties to the family trust, isolating me from any conflict of interest. They believed they had left me destitute and broken. They had no idea that by forcing me to sign that waiver, they had just given my private equity firm the legal clearance to annihilate Sterling Logistics. The game was on. 1 month had passed since the agonizing spectacle at the Ritz-Carlton. I sat in my minimalist, ultra-modern office on the 42nd floor of a glass high-rise in downtown Atlanta, staring out at the sprawling concrete jungle below. The walls of my workspace were stark white, intentionally stripped of any personal photographs or sentimental decorations, reflecting the cold, calculated nature of my profession. I did not work as a mid-level accountant, and was the founder and chief executive officer of Vanguard Intelligence, one of the most ruthless, classified forensic auditing and private equity firms on the East Coast. My firm contracted with federal agencies and institutional lenders to track stolen assets, identify corporate fraud, and liquidate corrupt companies. My job was not to build companies up or offer strategic advice to struggling entrepreneurs. My job was to dissect corporations when they failed, strip away the glossy corporate facade, and expose the rotting financial core underneath. I analyzed disaster for a living, and today I was staring at a masterpiece of absolute financial ruin. The serene silence of my office was a stark contrast to the screaming, laughing, and intense humiliation I had endured 30 days prior. Here numbers did not lie and spreadsheets did not possess arrogant egos. The dual monitors on my heavy mahogany desk displayed a labyrinth of offshore accounts, falsified vendor invoices, and severely breached contracts. I was currently personally leading the compliance audit on a massive defaulting mezzanine loan portfolio that my firm had recently acquired. The data glowing on my high-resolution screens painted a clear, undeniable picture of gross financial negligence and blatant, felonious wire fraud. I traced the digital paper trail with surgical, unemotional precision. The primary borrower had systematically violated multiple default covenants over the past 3 fiscal quarters. Instead of reinvesting the borrowed capital into operational infrastructure and fleet upgrades, as mandated by the strict loan terms, the executive board had siphoned the funds through a complex web of shell corporations registered in the Cayman Islands and Delaware. It was a textbook embezzlement scheme, executed with a level of arrogance and carelessness that bordered on comical. I ran a cross-reference on the corporate tax identification numbers, matching the offshore wire transfers back to the parent company, and pressed the Enter key to pull up the final consolidated ledger, running Vanguard's proprietary algorithm to unmask the ultimate beneficial owner. The progress bar loaded, and the name of the parent company flashed in bold red letters across my screen. It made my breath hitch sharply in my throat. Sterling Logistics, my father's billion-dollar empire, was not just bleeding money. It was hemorrhaging cash at a fatal rate, and the digital trail of $15 million in embezzled funds led to the office of his newly appointed chief financial officer, my brother-in-law DeAndre. I stared at the screen, letting the magnitude of the discovery wash over me. DeAndre, the golden son-in-law, who wore custom suits and drove imported sports cars, had used the company's operating capital as his personal piggy bank. He had breached the debt service coverage ratio, triggering an automatic acceleration clause. The entire massive loan was now due immediately, and Vanguard Intelligence held the debt. The discovery was not merely a professional victory, it was a profoundly personal vindication. For years, Sterling had paraded his logistics empire as the ultimate monument to his own unmatched intellect. He had constantly reminded me that my refusal to join the family business was a sign of my fundamental inadequacy, and had used his wealth as a bludgeon, a heavy weapon designed to keep everyone in his orbit compliant and terrified. And yet here it was, laid bare on my dual monitors in glowing red digits, the undeniable proof that his entire monument was built on rotting, hollow foundations. I leaned forward in my ergonomic leather chair, my eyes scanning the intricate web of deceit DeAndre had constructed. The arrogance of the man was simply staggering. He had not even bothered to employ advanced, cryptographic laundering techniques. DeAndre had operated with the sloppy, entitled laziness of a man who believed he was untouchable. He had routed the funds through 3 domestic shell corporations, ghost-tier LLCs registered in Delaware with generic, meaningless names like Apex Forwarding and Summit Logistics Holdings. From there, the capital was fractured into smaller, seemingly innocuous payments, disguised as consulting fees and offshore vendor acquisitions. But DeAndre had failed to realize that Vanguard Intelligence did not rely on standard auditing protocols. We utilized a proprietary, military-grade algorithmic tracking system designed specifically to penetrate these exact types of elementary layering schemes. My team had spent the last 48 hours running predictive models on the offshore accounts. We had traced the final destination of the embezzled funds to a notoriously secretive private bank in the Cayman Islands. The digital footprint was a mile wide. DeAndre had executed the primary wire transfers using the corporate virtual private network, leaving an undeniable IP address trail that linked the theft to his executive suite. Furthermore, he had authorized the transactions at 2 a.m, on a Sunday, a blatant violation of standard corporate banking hours that had immediately triggered an automated alert within our security matrix. As I dug deeper into the financial ledgers, the sheer scale of the incompetence became breathtaking. DeAndre had not just stolen the $15 million to fund a lavish lifestyle. He had engaged in high-risk, uncollateralized cryptocurrency margin trading, and had taken the operational lifeblood of Sterling Logistics and thrown it onto the digital roulette wheel, chasing astronomical returns to cover up his previous, smaller embezzlements. When the crypto market inevitably suffered a sudden, violent correction, DeAndre's leveraged positions had been wiped out in a matter of hours. The $15 million was gone, vaporized. Sterling Logistics was now technically insolvent. They could not make their quarterly vendor payouts and could not service the massive mezzanine loan they had secured from my firm. The corporate credit lines were maxed out, and the executive board, blinded by my father's dictatorial leadership and DeAndre's fabricated prospectus reports, was oblivious to the impending catastrophic collapse. I felt a cold, sharp smile touch the corners of my lips. My father had stood in front of 300 elite guests at my wedding and declared that I was a broke embarrassment. He had proclaimed that my public school teacher husband brought zero value to the family legacy, and had thrown me out of his kingdom because he believed his kingdom was impenetrable. He had no idea that I possessed the absolute power to legally raze his kingdom to the ground. I reached for my encrypted corporate phone, bypassing my personal cell, and dialed the direct line to Vanguard Intelligence's senior compliance director. The line connected immediately. Execute the default protocols on the Sterling Logistics mezzanine portfolio. I ordered, my voice steady, analytical, and devoid of emotion. Trigger the acceleration clause immediately. I want a hard freeze placed on all associated operational accounts, corporate credit lines, and executive compensation funds. Contact our international liaisons and have the Cayman Island accounts frozen, pending a federal indictment. proceed with the immediate repossession of all luxury vehicles and properties leveraged as collateral under DeAndre Rollins's personal guarantees. Understood, Ms. Vance, the compliance director replied efficiently. The automated triggers will take effect within the hour. Federal marshals will be dispatched to serve the subpoenas by tomorrow morning. Excellent, I said softly. Let the slaughter begin. I ended the call and set the encrypted phone down on the polished mahogany surface of my desk. The silence in my office was heavy, charged with the undeniable electric hum of absolute power. I stood up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling glass window, looking down at the bustling streets of downtown Atlanta, and watched the tiny, insignificant cars moving through the concrete canyons, unaware of the financial earthquake I had just unleashed. For the first time in my 30 years of life, the suffocating shadow of the Sterling family legacy was gone. I was no longer the disappointing daughter, and was no longer the rebellious outcast who had refused to wear the right dresses or attend the right galas. I was the architect of their total destruction and had built my empire in the shadows, mastering the complex, cutthroat world of high-level corporate finance while they had spent their time curating their public image for the society pages. They had spent their entire lives treating people like disposable assets, and had viewed my marriage as a bad investment to be liquidated. Now they were about to experience what it felt like to be on the receiving end of a ruthless, unapologetic liquidation. I turned back to my dual monitors. The red warning flags on the Sterling Logistics account were multiplying as the Vanguard automated systems initiated the hard freeze. The bank accounts were locking down, the credit cards were declining, the luxury cars were being tagged for immediate repossession. The impregnable fortress was crumbling, brick by expensive brick. And the absolute best part? My father had personally, aggressively, and very publicly severed my legal ties to the family trust 30 days ago. By disowning me, he had removed any potential conflict of interest that could have prevented me from taking this action. His own fragile, toxic ego had handed me the exact legal clearance I needed to execute this flawless, devastating strike. As I watched the digital collapse of his empire, I felt a profound, deep-seated sense of peace. The scared, eager-to-please little girl, who had once stood shivering in the freezing rain on the night of the cotillion gala, was finally, permanently dead. In her place stood a woman forged in absolute steel. The sharp, sudden ring of my personal cell phone shattered the dead silence of my office, pulling my eyes away from the damning evidence on the monitors. I glanced at the caller ID flashing on the screen. It was Vivienne, my mother. She had not reached out to me since the moment she sat and watched my father rip my trust fund to shreds at my wedding reception, and had not called to ask about my honeymoon, nor had she texted to see how Julian and I were settling into our married life, and let the phone ring 3 times, savoring the unusual, desperate persistence before finally picking up. I did not offer a polite greeting or ask how she was doing, and simply answered and listened to the heavy, frantic breathing on the other end of the line. The voice that finally spoke was stripped of its usual polished high society haughtiness. Vivian was practically hyperventilating, her words tumbling out in a frantic, uncoordinated rush that lacked any of her trademark grace. She sounded unhinged, demanding that I pack a bag and drive to the family estate in Martha's Vineyard immediately. There were no pleasantries, no apologies for the wedding, just raw, unfiltered panic echoing through the receiver. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, my eyes still fixed on the glowing red numbers highlighting DeAndre's offshore transfers. "You have not spoken a single word to me since you told your country club friends that my wedding was a charity event," I said, keeping my tone flat and devoid of any daughterly warmth. "Why call me now? Did DeAndre total another Lamborghini you bought him with company money, or did the country club finally reject your annual gala proposal? Do not speak to me with that disrespectful tone." Vivian snapped, though the usual venom in her voice was overshadowed by pure terror. "Sterling Logistics is froze. The bank accounts, the credit lines, the vendor payouts. Everything is locked down by some faceless corporate predator. We need you to come here right now and pull a second mortgage on your apartment to bail Chloe out." I let out a sharp, incredulous laugh that echoed off the glass walls of my office. The sheer audacity of her request was staggering. I stared at the red numbers highlighting DeAndre's fraudulent wire transfers. You want me to leverage my own home, the tiny apartment you assume I live in, to bail out the golden child you literally stood by and watched Dad disown me for a month ago? I asked coldly. You laughed when he told me I would be living in poverty. Now you are demanding my money. This is a family emergency, Maya. Vivian cried, her voice cracking in a high-pitched wail I had never heard before. The federal marshals were at the corporate headquarters this morning serving subpoenas. They are threatening to seize Chloe's personal assets. She is terrified. You have excellent credit and live like a pauper anyway, so I know you have equity. You can take out $1 million line of credit against your place and transfer it to DeAndre's legal defense fund by tomorrow morning. Family protects family, Maya. Family protects family, I repeated, the bitter irony heavy on my tongue. Like the time you locked me outside in the pouring rain when I was 12 years old because I accidentally stained my dress right before your cotillion gala. You let me stand shivering on the porch for 3 hours so I wouldn't ruin your perfect black elite family portrait, and have never protected me. Now you want me to bleed myself dry to protect your crumbling facade. Stop living in the past, Vivian shrieked, the panic taking full control of her vocal cords. If Sterling goes down, we all go down. We will lose the Vineyard estate. I will lose my country club standing. Do you want your sister to be homeless? Do you want your father to go to federal prison? I want you to explain to me why DeAndre needs $1 million legal defense fund, I said, baiting her, watching the cursor blink on my screen next to DeAndre's falsified Cayman Island invoices. What did the golden son-in-law do? He did nothing wrong, Vivian hissed defensively, protecting the man who had given her the illusion of high society perfection. It is a massive misunderstanding, a clerical error with some mezzanine debt lenders. DeAndre is a brilliant financial mind. He just needs temporary liquidity to satisfy the margin call until the lawyers can sort out this aggressive corporate overreach. You are his sister and owe this family your loyalty. The pieces snapped together in my mind with a satisfying, violent click. Sterling Logistics was not just failing due to market forces. It was being dismantled by the very private equity firm I owned. I was the one holding the scalpel, and looked at the executive summary on my screen, highlighting the exact clause that authorized the immediate freezing of all operational accounts. I had personally approved that automated trigger just 72 hours ago. My mother was begging me to save them from a financial execution that I had orchestrated. I will be at the estate in 4 hours, I said calmly, ignoring her ongoing hysterical demands for wire transfer details, and closed my laptop with a definitive snap, severing the digital connection to her ruined empire. Do not do anything until I get there. I did not agree to drive to Martha's Vineyard to offer a loan, or agree to go there to save my sister or rescue my father's legacy, or preserve my mother's elite social standing, and grabbed my car keys and my heavy leather briefcase, feeling the cold, hard weight of the audit files inside. I was going to the lion's den, not as a disgraced daughter, but as the executioner, ready to deliver the final, fatal blow. The drive to Martha's Vineyard gave me plenty of time to mentally prepare for the storm I was about to walk into. The ferry ride was usually a time for wealthy vacationers to sip overpriced coffee and admire the ocean view, but today the gray, churning water matched my mood. I navigated my sensible sedan down the familiar, winding coastal roads, passing towering hedges and wrought iron gates that guarded the summer homes of the elite. When I finally pulled up to the sprawling Sterling family estate, the immediate visual cues of sudden, catastrophic ruin were impossible to ignore. The pristine circular driveway, usually a showcase for my family's absurd wealth, looked like a crime scene. DeAndre's fleet of flashy sports cars, a matte black Lamborghini, and a cherry red Ferrari that Chloe flaunted constantly on her social media wear, parked haphazardly. But they were no longer symbols of status. Plastered across the driver's side windshield of each luxury vehicle was a massive, Neon yellow bank repossession sticker. The bright, garish yellow clashed violently against the sophisticated backdrop of the manicured landscaping. I parked my car neatly next to a towering oak tree, taking a slow, steadying breath, and grabbed my heavy leather briefcase, feeling the solid weight of the audit files inside. This was no longer a home to me, it was a crime scene, and I was holding the murder weapon, and pushed open the heavy mahogany front doors, stepping into the grand foyer. The atmosphere inside was absolute, unadulterated chaos. The usual quiet elegance of the house was shattered by the sound of my father, screaming at the top of his lungs. Sterling was pacing frantically back and forth across the custom Persian rug in the sunken living room. His usually immaculate tailored suit jacket was discarded on a chair. His silk tie was violently loosened, and his dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar. Thick, prominent veins bulged dangerously along his neck and forehead as he roared into his cell phone, barking orders at someone who clearly had no power to help him. A few feet away, my mother Vivian was a portrait of shattered high society grace. She was huddled on the edge of a white velvet sofa, wearing a silk dressing gown that looked out of place in the middle of the afternoon. Her hands were trembling so violently that the ice in her crystal glass clinked against the sides. As she raised the glass to her lips, a generous splash of amber scotch spilled over the rim, staining the pristine white velvet upholstery. She did not even seem to notice. The invincible, untouchable Sterling family was unraveling in real time. Sterling abruptly ended his call, slamming his phone down onto a marble side table with enough force to chip the stone. He spun around, his chest heaving, and finally locked eyes with me, standing in the entryway, and did not look relieved to see his daughter. He looked at me like an asset he needed to immediately liquidate. "It is about time you got here," Sterling snapped, his voice rough and ragged from shouting. He marched toward me, closing the distance with aggressive, heavy steps. "Listen to me very carefully, Maya. The banks are pulling a coordinated stunt. They have frozen the corporate accounts and locked up the personal lines of credit. It is a temporary cash flow squeeze, but they are going after DeAndre. We need immediate liquid capital." I stood my ground, my fingers gripping the handle of my briefcase. "And what does DeAndre's temporary cash flow squeeze have to do with me? I am not asking for a favor." Sterling barked, pointing a rigid finger at my face. "I am giving you instructions. You are going to liquidate your entire retirement savings today. Then you are going to go to your bank and pull a maximum equity line of credit against your apartment. DeAndre needs a temporary legal bond, and he needs it wired to his defense attorney by the close of business tomorrow." I stared at him, letting a cold, humorless scoff escape my lips. The audacity was breathtaking. "You want me to liquidate my savings?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously calm. "The same savings you mocked 1 month ago. You want the humble, pathetic teacher's wife to bail out your genius chief financial officer?" Vivian suddenly stood up from the sofa, the ice clinking wildly in her glass. She stepped forward, her face twisted in a desperate attempt to manipulate the narrative. "Maya, stop being so petty," she cried, her voice shrill and trembling. "This is not the time to hold grudges about a wedding toast. This is about family loyalty. We are talking about our legacy, Maya, and built a historic empire. And you are going to let some faceless banking predators tear it down because your feelings are hurt. You have a duty to this family. You have a duty to protect your sister." The hypocrisy was so thick I could practically taste it in the air. I tightened my grip on my briefcase, my voice dropping to a surgical, icy register. "Family loyalty," I shot back, taking a slow, deliberate step toward her. "You want to invoke family loyalty right now? Where was that loyalty when I was 12 years old? Do you remember that night, Mother? I accidentally spilled juice on my dress 2 hours before your prestigious cotillion gala. Instead of helping me, you dragged me out the back door and locked me outside in the freezing rain, so I wouldn't ruin your perfect family photographs. You let me stand there shivering in the dark while you smiled and posed with Chloe for the society pages, and have never been loyal to me. You are only loyal to the facade, And I am not bleeding myself dry to protect your fake, crumbling empire. My words hit the room like a physical shockwave. Vivian gasped, staggering back a step and clutching a hand to her chest as if she had been struck. She looked appalled that her favorite manipulation tactic had failed spectacularly. Sterling, however, did not retreat. My defiance ignited a volatile explosive rage inside him. He let out a furious roar and slammed his closed fist down onto the center of the massive, custom glass coffee table. A loud, sharp crack echoed through the cavernous living room as a deep fissure spiderwebbed across the thick glass surface. "You ungrateful, insolent little girl." Sterling roared, his face turning an alarming shade of crimson. He stepped right up to me, his imposing frame trying to physically intimidate me into submission. "You think you can just walk away from this? You think you can stand there and lecture us while my company is under attack? If you do not sign that apartment over to me today, I will personally destroy that pathetic husband of yours." He leaned in closer, his breath hot and ragged against my face. "You think a public school teacher is untouchable? I play golf every single Sunday with the superintendent of the city school board, and will make one phone call. Maya. Just one, and Julian will be fired before the first bell rings tomorrow morning. He will be blacklisted. He will never teach in this state again. You will both be living on the street." He stood there breathing heavily, a triumphant, cruel sneer forming on his lips. He believed he had just played the ultimate trump card. He thought he had found the exact leverage he needed to break me. Before Sterling could utter another threat, a heavy, resounding thud echoed from the front of the house. The massive, solid oak front doors of the mansion swung open with a forceful, commanding presence that silenced the room. Sterling spun around, his eyes widening in shock. Julian stepped over the threshold and into the grand foyer. He was wearing his typical tweed jacket and sensible loafers, looking like the dedicated public school teacher he was. But the quiet, immense authority he radiated filled the entire room. And he was not alone, flanking my husband on either side, their badges clearly visible on their belts, were two grim-faced federal agents. The sudden appearance of Julian in the grand foyer paralyzed the room. The heavy oak doors slowly clicked shut behind him, sealing us inside the sprawling mansion. Julian stood composed. He did not look intimidated by the billionaire's mansion or the chaotic, screaming family, and simply looked at me, offering a soft, reassuring nod that silently communicated he had my back, just as he always did. Beside him stood two men in sharp dark suits, their expressions unreadable, the metallic glint of federal badges clipped to their belts. For a fraction of a second, the only sound in the cavernous living room was the ragged, heavy breathing of my father. Then the shock wore off and DeAndre decided to play his usual role. DeAndre stepped forward, pushing past my sister Chloe, who was staring open-mouthed at the unexpected intrusion. He was sweating profusely, thick beads of moisture gathering on his forehead and ruining the crisp collar of his expensive Tom Ford shirt. Despite the visible panic in his eyes, he tried to puff out his chest and project the arrogant persona he had cultivated on my father's dime. He let out a loud, forced scoff, attempting to diminish the undeniable threat standing in the entryway. "What is this supposed to be?" DeAndre sneered, his voice cracking slightly on the last word. He pointed a trembling finger at Julian. "Did the broke history teacher bring his little hall monitors to a billionaire's house? You think you can just march into this estate and play dress-up? You are trespassing, Julian. You and your rent-a-cops need to turn around and walk right back out that door before I have security throw you off the island." Julian did not even blink. He ignored DeAndre, treating him with the exact same dismissive silence that one might reserve for a buzzing insect, and did not offer a witty comeback or raise his voice to defend himself. His absolute stillness was far more intimidating than any shouting match could ever be. He simply turned his head slightly and looked at the men flanking him. The two federal agents moved with practiced, synchronized precision. They bypassed Julian and stepped into the sunken living room, instantly invading the personal space DeAndre was trying so hard to defend. The lead agent reached inside his suit jacket and produced a thick, folded legal document bearing the seal of the United States Department of Justice. DeAndre Rollins, the lead agent stated, his voice a flat, booming baritone that left no room for negotiation. We are executing a federal warrant for your arrest. You are being charged with multiple counts of corporate wire fraud, money laundering, and the embezzlement of corporate funds across international borders. The color drained from DeAndre's face, leaving him looking like a ghost trapped inside an expensive suit. His arrogant posture evaporated instantly, his knees buckled slightly, and he stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the edge of the custom Persian rug. He looked frantically around the room, his wide, terrified eyes darting from the federal agents to Chloe, and finally landing on my father, and was a man who had built his entire identity on the protection and wealth of Sterling Logistics. And now that shield was being violently ripped away. "Sterling, you have to do something," DeAndre pleaded, his voice climbing an entire octave in pure unadulterated panic. He threw his hands up, gesturing wildly toward the agents. "Tell them they are making a mistake. Call your legal team, tell them to back off. I didn't do anything wrong, I was just restructuring our liquid assets. I was executing the investment strategy we talked about." My father stood frozen by the cracked glass coffee table, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to comprehend how his impregnable fortress was being breached, and did not give him the chance to speak. I stepped forward, stepping out of the shadow of my family's chaos and into my power as a senior corporate executioner, and opened the heavy brass clasps of my leather briefcase. The sharp metallic clicks echoed like gunshots in the tense room. I pulled out a thick, tabbed financial dossier and dropped it onto the only uncracked section of the glass table. "He cannot save you, DeAndre," I said, my voice devoid of anger, replacing it with cold, absolute authority. "Sterling cannot make a single phone call to protect you, because Sterling Logistics no longer controls its own capital. You did not execute an investment strategy, you executed a suicide mission." DeAndre whipped his head toward me, his breathing shallow and rapid. "You don't know what you are talking about, Maya. You are just a glorified accountant. You don't understand high-level corporate finance." "I understand it perfectly," I replied, staring into his terrified eyes. "You told my father in the executive board that you were investing $10 million into a revolutionary new blockchain startup to diversify the company's portfolio. You generated fake prospectus reports and handed out fraudulent return projections. But you never invested a single dime into any startup, did you, DeAndre?" I tapped the thick dossier on the table, forcing him to look at the undeniable proof of his crimes. "You violated the default covenants of a massive mezzanine loan that Sterling Logistics secured from Vanguard Intelligence just 8 months ago." I continued, my voice echoing relentlessly in the quiet room. "The terms of that loan explicitly prohibited unauthorized capital distributions outside of approved operational expenses. But you thought you were smarter than the institutional lenders. You bypassed the compliance protocols and siphoned $15.4 million out of the primary holding account. You ran those funds through a predictable elementary layering scheme and bounced the money across 3 different domestic shell corporations before finally wiring the entire sum into an offshore account registered in the Cayman Islands." The room fell into a suffocating dead silence. Chloe let out a small strangled gasp, her hands flying to cover her mouth, as she stared at her husband in mounting horror. Vivian remained rigid on the sofa, her eyes darting frantically between me and the financial documents, trying to reject the reality unfolding in her living room. "I tracked every single digital footprint you left behind," I continued, relentlessly dismantling his false genius piece by piece. "You used the corporate VPN to execute the offshore transfers, leaving an IP address trail that a first-year auditing intern could have flagged. You authorized the wire transfers at 2 in the morning on a Sunday, triggering an automatic algorithmic alert in the lender's security system. You left a digital breadcrumb trail miles wide, DeAndre. The funds in the Cayman accounts have already been frozen by international authorities. You are bankrupt, and you are going to federal prison." DeAndre opened his mouth to deny it, but no words came out. He just stood there, his jaw trembling, looking like the incompetent fraud he was. But my father, blinded by decades of unchecked ego and absolute control, utterly refused to accept defeat. Admitting that DeAndre had stolen from him meant admitting that his own judgment was flawed, and Sterling would rather watch his company burn to the ground than admit he was wrong. He snapped out of his shock and flew into a blinding, destructive rage. "This is an absolute outrage," Sterling bellowed, his face twisting into a mask of pure fury. He marched around the cracked glass table, placing himself between DeAndre and the federal agents, and pointed his finger at me, then at Julian. "You think you can come into my home and orchestrate this circus? I do not care what your little spreadsheets say, Maya. Vanguard Intelligence is nothing but a faceless predatory hedge fund. They think they can freeze my accounts over a minor covenant breach. I will tie them up in litigation for the next 10 years. I will deploy an army of corporate attorneys to bury them in injunctions. I will crush Vanguard Intelligence in federal court until they are begging to settle for pennies." Sterling then turned his wrath on Julian, his chest heaving with misplaced confidence. He believed he was still the most powerful man in the room. "And as for you," Sterling spat, stepping into Julian's personal space, "you are trespassing on private property. I warned you what would happen if you ever crossed me. I am calling the superintendent right now. You are going to be dragged out of here in handcuffs, and I promise you, I will make sure you never step foot inside a classroom again." "You are finished." Sterling reached violently into his pocket, pulling out his cell phone and furiously unlocking the screen to make good on his threat. He was operating on pure, delusional adrenaline, oblivious to the trap that had already snapped shut around him. Julian did not flinch, he did not step backward, and looked at me, yielding the floor completely. This was my battle, and he was simply there to watch me win it. I maintained my steady, unblinking gaze on my father. Slowly, deliberately, I reached inside my blazer pocket. My father paused, his thumb hovering over the keypad of his phone, suddenly wary of what I was doing, and pulled out a sleek, heavy, matte black metal business card. The edges were sharply defined, and a single embossed crest caught the light of the chandelier above. With a smooth, effortless motion, I tossed the heavy metal card onto the coffee table. It landed on the pristine glass, right next to the massive spider-webbed crack my father had just created, and slid across the surface until it stopped in front of Sterling's hands. "You are more than welcome to try and crush my company in federal court, Sterling," I said, my voice dropping to a smooth, dangerous timbre that commanded absolute obedience. "But I recommend you read that card before you make a phone call you cannot afford." Sterling glared at me for a long, tense second, his chest still heaving with indignation. With a sharp scoff of absolute dismissal, he looked down at the table and snatched the heavy black metal card off the glass. He held it up to the light, his eyes narrowing as he read the minimalist silver text engraved on the surface. I stood silently beside my husband and watched the exact moment my father realized his entire world had just ended. Sterling stopped breathing, the aggressive, furious flush of color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His broad shoulders, which had been thrown back in arrogant defiance just seconds ago, suddenly slumped forward as if an invisible crushing weight had been dropped onto his spine. His hands began to shake so violently that the heavy metal card rattled against his gold wedding band. He stared at the engraved text, his eyes wide and unblinking, his mind failing to process the catastrophic paradigm shift. The man who had publicly disowned me for marrying a nobody was now holding the undeniable proof that he had just threatened to destroy the very woman who held his entire billion-dollar empire in the palm of her hand. Sterling's eyes remained locked on the matte black metal card. His lips parted slightly, but the furious threats that had been pouring from his mouth just seconds prior were gone. The silence in the grand foyer was sudden and absolute, heavy with the terrifying gravity of his catastrophic realization. He stared at the crisp silver lettering engraved into the metal, his mind trying to reject the information his eyes were processing. The text was minimalist, elegant, and impossible to misinterpret. It read, Maya Vance, founder and chief executive officer, Vanguard Intelligence. The air seemed to evacuate the sprawling mansion. Sterling looked up from the card, his gaze finally meeting mine. The blatant disdain, the arrogant superiority, and the mocking condescension that had defined my father's attitude toward me for my entire adult life vanished in an instant. In its place was a raw, unadulterated terror that aged him a decade in the span of a single heartbeat. He looked down at the card again, his hands trembling so violently that the metal edges clinked against his wedding band, hoping the words would miraculously alter themselves. They did not. Vivian, sensing the radical violent shift in the power dynamic, stood up from the stained white velvet sofa. She clutched her silk dressing gown tightly around her waist, taking a hesitant, fearful step forward. Her voice was a fragile, trembling whisper as she asked Sterling what was wrong, begging him to tell her what the card said. Sterling ignored her. He could not tear his eyes away from me. The daughter he had promised to leave destitute on the street. The woman he had just ordered to mortgage her apartment. DeAndre, still sweating profusely under the intense scrutiny of the federal agents, tried to lean over Sterling's shoulder to read the card. When he saw the name Vanguard Intelligence, his knees visibly buckled. He let out a pathetic, high-pitched whimper, stumbling backward until he hit the edge of the sofa. Chloe grabbed his arm, demanding to know what was happening, but DeAndre was hyperventilating too hard to formulate a coherent sentence. I finally broke the suffocating silence and did not raise my voice or need to. The quiet, resonant authority in my tone commanded the entire room, forcing everyone to listen with absolute, undivided attention. You thought you held all the cards at my wedding, didn't you, Dad? I asked, my voice echoing with a surgical precision that cut straight through his remaining defenses. You thought by forcing Julian to sign that spousal waiver, you were punishing me, and thought you were stripping away my safety net and leaving me with nothing. I took a slow, deliberate step toward him, my polished heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. But you made one fatal miscalculation, I continued, staring into his terrified eyes. By legally severing my ties to the Sterling family trust, you removed my conflict of interest. If I was still legally bound to your estate, federal banking regulations would have prevented Vanguard Intelligence from acquiring your debt. By disowning me in front of 300 people, you gave me the exact legal clearance I needed to purchase your defaulting loans, freeze your assets, and dismantle your company piece by piece. The revelation hit Sterling like a physical, devastating blow. The domineering, terrifying patriarch who had ruled our family and his corporate boardroom with an iron fist began to physically crumble in front of my eyes. His broad shoulders hunched forward, losing their aggressive posture. The healthy color drained from his face, leaving behind a sickly ashen gray pallor. For the first time in his entire life, Sterling was undeniably not the smartest or the wealthiest person in the room, and the realization shattered his entire worldview. I didn't choose to be an auditor because I wanted a quiet, mediocre life, I explained, my voice devoid of any warmth. I chose it because I wanted to understand how corrupt men like you hide their money. Vanguard Intelligence isn't just a hedge fund, we are a federally contracted financial juggernaut. I track global corruption, I dismantle corporate fraud. I built an empire in total silence, while you were busy showing off your leased sports cars and throwing charity galas. I looked over at Chloe, who was now weeping openly, her flawless makeup running down her face in dark streaks. You mocked me for refusing to wear a designer gown, and mocked me for marrying a man who actually loves me, instead of a man who looks good on a balance sheet. Julian is a dedicated educator who shapes the future. DeAndre is a federal criminal who just bankrupted your entire future. But self-preservation is a powerful, desperate instinct. Sterling swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously against his unbuttoned dress shirt collar. He tried to switch tactics, shifting from the role of the aggressive executioner to the pragmatic businessman. He attempted to salvage the unsalvageable, forcing a strained, unnatural smile onto his face. He actually believed he could negotiate his way out of a federal indictment. Sterling held his hands up in a placating, subservient gesture, his voice adopting a sickeningly smooth, conciliatory tone that made my stomach turn. He addressed me, attempting to establish a false equal camaraderie that had never existed between us. "Maya, sweetheart," Sterling began, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to sound composed. "There has simply been a massive misunderstanding, a regrettable failure of communication. You are brilliant, and have clearly proven that. You built an incredible firm, and I am so proud of you." The sheer desperation in his voice was palpable as he offered me a coveted seat on the Sterling Logistics executive board. He promised me unprecedented equity in the company, complete operational transparency moving forward, and a guaranteed annual return that would dwarf whatever penalty interest Vanguard Intelligence was currently expecting to collect. "We can fix this internally," Sterling pleaded, sweat now joining DeAndre's on his brow. "All you have to do is call off the federal marshals, unfreeze the operational accounts. We will fire DeAndre today, and we'll restructure the debt under your supervision. You can take complete control of the company, Maya. Whatever you want, it is yours. We are family." DeAndre nodded vigorously from his position by the sofa, tears streaming down his face as he silently begged me to take the deal. Vivian clasped her hands together in silent prayer, watching my face for any sign of mercy. I looked at the people who had terrorized me, belittled me, and tried to destroy my marriage, and felt nothing for them, no pity, no lingering desire for their approval, just cold, absolute finality. "I am not here to negotiate, Sterling," I stated, my voice echoing with the undeniable weight of a judge delivering a final sentence. "I am here to collect." I turned my head slightly and gave a single nod to the lead federal agent. The agent stepped forward, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. He grabbed DeAndre roughly by the arm, spinning him around and slamming him face first against the white velvet sofa. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs, locking around DeAndre's wrists, echoed through the room. "DeAndre Rollins, you are under arrest," the agent repeated firmly, ignoring DeAndre's hysterical, high-pitched sobbing. "Chloe, do something," DeAndre screamed, losing any remaining shred of his dignity. He thrashed against the agents as they hauled him to his feet. "Sterling, don't let them take me. Please." Chloe shrank back against the wall, covering her ears, powerless to stop the destruction of her curated life. The agents dragged DeAndre toward the grand oak doors. His expensive Italian leather shoes dragged uselessly across the custom Persian rug. His desperate screams echoed through the foyer, until the heavy doors swung shut behind them, cutting off the sound completely. Sterling stood frozen, his mouth hanging slightly open, watching the final nail being driven into the coffin of his empire. "Sterling Logistics will be liquidated by Friday," I informed him, delivering the final, fatal blow. "The corporate accounts are gone. Your personal assets, which you leveraged against the company, will be seized by the end of the week. This estate, the country club memberships, the luxury cars, it is all gone." Vivian let out a shattered, agonizing wail. She collapsed onto her knees on the stained Persian rug, burying her face in her hands, weeping for the loss of her pristine, untouchable status. "You can't do this to us, Maya," Sterling whispered, his voice finally breaking, the arrogant billionaire reduced to a broken, powerless old man. "We are your blood." "My blood walked out of that wedding reception with me," I replied coldly, reaching out and taking Julian's hand. His grip was warm, strong, and reassuring. "You are just a bad investment I finally decided to liquidate." I turned my back on them, and did not offer a final goodbye or look back at the wreckage I had orchestrated. I walked toward the heavy oak doors with my head held high, my husband by my side and my empire secure. The drive back to the city was silent, but it was a silence filled with absolute, profound clarity. I looked out the window at the ocean, the gray churning water now giving way to a stunning, brilliant sunset. The sky was painted in vibrant streaks of crimson, gold, and deep purple, a breathtaking contrast to the ugly, decaying world I had just left behind. Julian drove with one hand on the steering wheel, his other hand resting warmly on my knee. We did not need to speak about what had just happened, or need to dissect the screaming, the begging, or the absolute pathetic collapse of my father's ego, and both knew that the Sterling family was permanently excised from our lives. They were no longer a looming shadow and were simply a closed file, a completed audit, a debt collected. I leaned my head against the cool glass of the passenger window, feeling the steady, powerful rhythm of the car engine, and thought about the little girl who had spent her entire childhood seeking the approval of people who were incapable of loving her. I had spent years trying to fit into their curated mold, trying to be the compliant, obedient daughter they demanded. But true freedom is not given, it is taken, it is forged in the fires of absolute unapologetic independence. I had built Vanguard Intelligence not just as a business, but as a fortress, and had surrounded myself with people who valued integrity over status, who valued intelligence over unearned privilege. Julian had stood by me, a constant, unwavering pillar of strength, unbothered by the superficial insults hurled at him by a man who was drowning in his own hubris. Tomorrow morning, the financial world would wake up to the news of Sterling Logistics complete, catastrophic collapse. The society pages would have a field day with the arrest of DeAndre Rollins. My mother would be permanently exiled from her precious country club, forced to face the reality of the lower middle class she had mocked so relentlessly at my wedding. And I would simply walk into my minimalist ultra-modern office, sit down at my heavy mahogany